Fantastic. Sorry. So this is Luke James at Impact Mobility. Welcome to the webinar. I appreciate we're running this over several different time zones across North America and into Europe as well. So good afternoon, good morning and good day. We're just giving this a minute or two because we should have several more folks tuning in very shortly. So if you're with us already, just give us a moment or two and we'll kick off very shortly. Cheers. Okay, folks, to those of you who are still joining us, hello again, it's Luke James at Impact Mobility. Welcome. We've got folks still coming in, I can see, but we're going to make a start anyway. So, to the room, welcome. This next hour, we're going to be talking about MaaS, or Mobility as a Service, or all the multimodal operating parts that contribute to this new transport dynamic that we're all excitedly operating and living in. So, as part of this conversation, we've got three really exciting speakers today. So, first of all, we have Tim McGuicken, who is the founder of MaaS America, which I think we'll hear lots more from shortly, and how that operates, what it is, how we're defining MaaS, what that looks like. We'll then move into Yovav Meidad, who's Chief Growth Officer at Moovit. Moovit, to those of you who don't know already, have got one of the most end-to-end systems in place, tracking all sorts of transit data with some really, really cool insights. And finally, Willie Doman from Auriga Corporation, who is another part of MaaS America, and will talk from a business model and strategy point of view. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Tim, who's going to kick us off, talking about MaaS America, what it stands for, and how we get there. So, Tim, good morning, and I'm going to share the screen now and pass over to you.
Okay.
Have you got the screen acceptance? Does that come through?
No, it hasn't come through yet. The screen acceptance button, no.
Okay, in which case we can run this from ours. Do you want to go to... we'll go to the first slide ourselves and we'll talk you through it this way. Okay?
So you're going to run it? Okay.
Yeah, hang on a second, we've gone the wrong way. This happens with live stuff, folks, so one moment. So here we go.
Okay.
Tim, when you want your next slide, just say and we'll change for you. Okay?
That sounds good. Well, thank you, everybody. Luke and Gareth, I want to first thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts on mobility as a service. I also want to thank my co-panelists, Jay and Willie. I get to start off the presentation, and I'll sound as the smartest one in the group until the next person speaks. So my title of my presentation is the title of the webinar, but honestly, I'm not going to be speaking so much about business models because my belief is that there are no prescribed business models for MaaS, but there are some things we can do to inform them. So next slide, please. A quick overview of what I'm going to speak about, a little bit about MaaS America. Again, then we'll be switching over to section 2, principles of a MaaS ecosystem. And then some thoughts on the future. And the reason I'm not I was going to put the word conclusions, but I think it would be a bit arrogant to have conclusions about the future of MaaS because it is still a nebulous, somewhat ill-defined concept. And Anybody can say that they do MaaS, anyone can say that they consult on MaaS, but it's truly still developing. So there are certainly elements of it that we all, I guess, associate with the concept. But so about MaaS America, principles of a MaaS ecosystem and thoughts on the future. Let's see. Well, first of all, let's go to the next slide, and that's essentially the definition. Mobility as a service. This is MaaS America's definition. I'll go into a little bit as to why we have that definition in a minute, but I'll just read it out because I wanted to speak to it a bit. MaaS is the delivery through an integrated digital platform and across all available modes of transport of seamless, infinitely adaptable personal mobility services. That's a MaaS America definition that the advisory committee put together soon after the founding of the organization in early 2019. So a couple things to notice about the definition. The first is that it's mode agnostic. It doesn't talk about transit, it doesn't talk about BRT, rail, cars, or anything. This is a very broad definition. The reason we wanted it broad was because anything can fit into it. Again, the longer the definition, the more detailed it is, the more limiting it becomes. So we decided to do a very broad definition. The other thing I wanted to point out on this is that it's also silent on the payment method. We don't talk about how you pay for your mobility services, whether it's a la carte or whether it's by subscription. Again, for instance, I've seen the concept of MaaS often tied to the idea of monthly subscriptions. People would pay to access to unlimited bundles of mobility services. I never quite got that. Why is MaaS associated with subscription and say the mobility on demand associated with pay as you go? There really anyone who says that those two go together, it's too early. It's wrong. It's really not part of the definition. It's not a requisite element, if you will, of mobility as a service. So at the bottom line, how you pay really isn't or should not be prescribed. So now, stepping back, why do we even have our own definition? And why is there a separate association for MaaS in America than, say, the MaaS Alliance, which is in Europe? Well, primarily because America is different from where MaaS was born. It's a different history, it's a different geography, it's a different governance model, and all of those factors combined to manifest in different business models, different manifestations of MaaS. So when I went to Europe a couple of years ago and it was exposed to MaaS, I was very excited. Lots of innovators. It was epiphany. I go to a lot of trade association meetings, a lot of mobility meetings, and some of the presentations become a little bit stale, and you hear the same thing. But this was a real fun time for me because there was a lot of new stuff. Talking to the organizers, we wanted to do a meeting in the United States, and we soon started to realize that the way MaaS, again, was being advanced, who the players were, who the actors were, was different. So we decided to create the unique association that would address mobility as a service in America. So that's, in a nutshell, why we have MaaS America. You can go to the website to learn more about it, but the presentation isn't about MaaS America so much, it's about the business model. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, a little bit about MaaS America. Sorry, my bad. So the vision of MaaS America is essentially the national deployment of effective MaaS ecosystems. And then you see the objectives and the mission. It's pretty standard stuff for trade associations. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. So go to the next slide, please, Luke. Okay, now principles of a MaaS ecosystem. This is where I want to spend a little bit of time. Again, we didn't think that business model could be something that at least MaaS America could opine upon at this presentation. But so look up top there. I've described a bit of a continuum of concepts. And in there, you'll see is a business model. What I mean by this continuum is that starting with a paradigm would inform the framework. The framework would inform the business model. The business model will inform the actors, so forth and so on. So just keep that in mind as I continue on to the next set of things I'm going to say. So historically, big disruptions in transportation have been driven by, in our view, a pretty clear motive. It's the profit motive. If you look at the history of the United States, we had our canal system, profit motive. Railroads, profit motive. And our first intercity highways were toll roads and turnpikes, built to make a profit. But for the last 60 years, probably stemming from the Interstate Act of 1956, the motive has been more about the social good. So that's a major change in paradigm to the social good. Infrastructure was essentially built to move a lot of people and a lot of goods, and profit was not the direct motive. We invested hundreds of billions of dollars for aggregate benefits. But now, in the last 10 years in particular, the paradigm's shifting again. If you look at transportation innovation, and I had a friend of mine at a workshop who just said, I'll just quote him, all the cool ideas on mobility are coming from the private sector. That was Larry Yermak. If you're on, thank you for that. And the motive behind all of these inventors, all these ventures, and all these innovations is really, again, clear. It's profit. And this motive is probably as disruptive as the actual technologies that MaaS is leveraging. So now, to the next paragraph in this slide. All business models are shaped and bounded by the goals and principles that you want to encourage or achieve through the deployment of that model. And the same holds for MaaS. If one group wanted to, say, maximize profits in their transportation service, or the other group wants to move everybody anywhere at any time for modest cost or no costs, those two goals would probably force very different business models. And each party would be pushing for their version of MaaS that channeled the market in its own direction at the expense of the other. We simply have to do better with MaaS. So, while we still really can't tell the details of what a successful business model is, because how success manifests itself will be different depending on where you deploy it, I mean, we can start talking about other things that we can impact. So we know the paradigm. The paradigm today is profit motive, might have an element called on-demand, seamlessness, and again, we believe that there can be no defined or definite model or business model that fits across all of our various cities. Cities are too different, they're too complex. But if we look at the framework, this supportive structure, we think that this element can be formed and informed by principles that encourage a result in business models that kind of give us what we want from our MaaS systems. And by principle, here's what I mean, a definition. I'm a big fan of definitions. A principle is a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as the foundation for a system. So now, moving to the next slide, please, Luke. These are the 5 principles that we think a framework should have in order to inform business models that give us MaaS systems that work for all of us. The first is inclusivity or inclusion. We all need mobility. So the direct role of transportation is really to enable the movement of people and goods. But indirectly, really, if you can't move, you can't contribute to our economy. Economy and lives stagnate if you can't do that. So while I personally regard mobility as a right, it's essential human value, the point is moving is simply an economic mandate. We need to get around. Therefore, the principle is MaaS systems should be inclusive and be designed to enable more movement by more people and goods, not less. We've seen some manifestations of MaaS be about restricting forms of mobility. We should be able to enhance and enable all forms of mobility, especially the ones that people want to use. Second is sustainable. And what I mean by sustainable is financial, because financial viability is critical to the success of any MaaS platform. The environment is incredibly important, but the belief is the need for mobility is more immediate. And really, other more effective actors will be addressing the environmental costs more directly than a MaaS application can. And ideally, a MaaS ecosystem will have a number of mobility network operators, and one of them will offer users a set of green mobility services that address their environmental concerns. And if that is a popular type of solution, that particular MNO will grow. So the next is low friction. So this is interesting again. Again, the definition of friction is any process that removes energy from a system over time. So when a system has friction, you essentially have to keep adding energy to keep it moving at the same rate. And with MaaS, so how do you remove friction? Well, we've heard about this before. You remove friction by making, say, an app easy to download, having a lot of options, and making services easy to buy. The point is, removing even small amounts of friction from the value delivery process can generate huge improvements in the adoption of services, which again in turn turns into more revenue and contributes back to the other principle of being financially sustainable. 2 more, guys. Low barriers to entry. This is a specific type of friction that really is applied to organizations. It makes it harder for startups or existing companies to enter, expand, or improve their performance in a market. These types of barriers and this type of friction could be regulations, IP restrictions, data access, or licensing limitations. So this principle is the requirement to enter a MaaS market should be clear and easy to navigate. The requirements to enter these markets should be clear and easy to navigate. They should not favor incumbents. They should not favor experts, quote unquote experts, or dominant players. So the final is balanced. This is an important one from an economic standpoint. MaaS should acknowledge that the public are stakeholders in their infrastructure. They're the ones who have invested their tax dollars to build our streets, build our subways, and so forth, and our highways. So they have a say in how private enterprise extracts value from their investments in infrastructure. So the ideal MaaS model in this economic sense would minimize rent seeking, or those entities who don't pay their fair share of quote unquote rent to use the infrastructure. And likewise, you might be thinking just the private sector, but likewise, under an ideal MaaS system, in the context of the public sector, again, an ideal MaaS would safeguard against unaccountable subsidies. But please don't believe that I think subsidies are bad. In fact, an ideal MaaS would permit the orchestration of subsidies that encourage the movement of the most people. And we see that in every mobility authority in America, MTA, MTC, Chicago Transit, they take from one to help enhance the other. In order to orchestrate the aggregate mobility, essentially you need to cross-subsidize on occasion. So now, before I go to the next slide, Luke, I didn't want to again say conclusions because I think it would be arrogant and premature to say we can make any conclusions about MaaS, because MaaS will manifest differently depending on the cities that it's being deployed in. So I'm leaving you with some observations and some facts so you can maybe draw your own conclusions. Go ahead, please. Next slide. So the American form of mobility, in my viewpoint, this is when I'm switching from MaaS America to Tim McGuckin, really has the car playing a role for a long time. Primarily because we have a huge vested investment in automobiles. If you can go to the next slide, we'll see some data here. So let's look at the size of the U.S. transit sector. It's 1.2 trillion, U.S. automobile sector. It's $1.2 trillion a year. That's the value of all goods and services associated with the U.S. auto sector. It's a lot larger than the U.S. transit sector. Why that is, we don't have time to go into, but that's the fact. The $72 billion of the U.S. transit sector is the value of all goods and services purchased by transit capital and operating expenses. So it's really quite equivalent to, in terms of market, to the sector, in terms of metric. But the auto sector is huge. It's a lot larger. And in a nutshell, it's really hard to turn a tanker that big, right? It's hard to stop it. So that's why I believe cars will be playing a role in our mobility for a long time. And looking at sort of the share of transit versus cars, nationally it's roughly 5% transit and about 86% car and carpooling. If you go into the cities, though, the major cities, that's much more favorable. It's about 20% on average in big American cities are taking transit, with about 76% going by car. And our biggest city, I think, our largest transit user is New York City. That accounts for a large percentage of overall boardings every year. So let's see. Next slide, please. So let's see here. Give me a second. MaaS, oops, go back again, please. I think you went too far. MaaS is about seamless movement, and it's not always automatically about reducing congestion or reducing travel time. That might be somewhat of a provocative statement, but we're about seamless mobility, getting from A to B in a pleasurable way, in a not necessarily always a fast way. So if you can continue to the next slide, I can go into a little bit more details about what I mean. I was just looking for numbers, and again, you can come up with your own conclusions, but the size of the U.S. economy is $20 trillion a year. That's the value, that's our GDP. And I just read a study the other day from INRIX that claims it's the most exhaustive study on the cost of congestion nationwide, and they peg it at a little over $300 billion. Well, if you divide those numbers, you're looking at the equivalent tax. What kind of congestion tax are we paying on this $20 trillion economy? Well, it's 1.5%. $300 billion is a lot of money, but it's only 1.5% of the U.S. economy, so I can see why some people might say, well, congestion isn't that critical of an issue. Again, I don't mean to believe one thing or another on congestion or be provocative for provocative sake, but it's just a statistic that I think was interesting. But if you go to major cities, that tax goes higher. LA metro area is 1.9% a tax, and New York metro area is 2.6%. But the next point I made on this was we might not necessarily adopt MaaS to reduce travel times. So look at the fact that we have 5G coming out. 5G is promising speed and data rates that's better than the fiber optic cables that we have plugged into our computers in our home. So let's consider reduced travel times. If you're a passenger, maybe you need to get to DC from Reston, like from where I live to where I might work, and I can take a higher priced 20-minute drive for $40, or I can take an hour ride for 15 on a secondary road, and it's not tolled, it's slower. But if I have near home-like data access, I can be quite productive in that hour ride and not care about it. So, and then I also talk about rideshare. AVs, I think, are a little bit further off, but rideshare, definitely. If I can hop in a car and be as productive as I am in my home office, then I don't mind. I would probably spend $15 rather than $40. So that's my second thought. Third and final is, if you transition, please, Luke. So MaaS is the disintermediation of transportation. Again, back to definitions. Disintermediation in finance is the withdrawal of funds from intermediary financial institutions, such as banks and savings and loan associations, to invest them directly. Think about E-Trade, Charles Schwab, Fidelity Investments. But generally, disintermediation is any process of removing the middleman or intermediary from future transactions. And the best example that I could think of about that happening now is Amazon. It's the disintermediator of retail, disconnected traditional retail service providers from their customers. And technology made it possible. Fast internet enabled instantaneous download speeds and permitted a virtual store with unlimited choices you could see in seconds. So now go to the next slide and the last slide. Again, some more facts. Another example of disintermediation in the hotel space. And I wrote an article about this on LinkedIn, I think for, it's called Vacation as a Service. Just look at Marriott and what it owns. It's a hotel chain with 6,000 hotels, 1.1 million rooms, in charge of managing probably $1.5 trillion worth of real estate. And its 2017 revenue is $22 billion. Its share price is $135, and its market cap is $42 billion. Now look at Booking, which is essentially a software company. It owns nothing. It doesn't own hotels. It doesn't own cruise lines. It just helps you book them. It's disintermediating travelers from the service providers. Their 2017 revenues were $12.5 billion. I can confirm that, but 2018 it's quite a bit more. Their share price is $1,900 a share. Their market cap, again, this is a software company, doesn't own any hard real estate, is $80 billion. So the reason I say this is that we need to look at where the market is going in terms of the actors in a MaaS ecosystem, who's going to be driving the discussion, who's going to be making those decisions that impact the ultimate basket of goods and services we call MaaS that we'll start buying soon, if not already. And then again, look at Uber. Just a couple little points on Uber. It's a mobility network operator. They're calling themselves a MaaS operator. They own, scooters and electric bike companies. They deliver food. They deliver freight. It's really software, data, and apps. They don't own really any vehicles. Their 2018 revenue is very negative. Their share price is reflective of that, but their market cap is $54 billion. So I'm just saying that the intermediaries, the disintermediaries, might be the entities that you're looking at to be the real actors in MaaS. And just another little fun fact. The CEO of Uber is Mr. Khosrowshahi. Before he came to Uber, he was the CEO of Booking Holdings, and he has said he wants Uber to be the Amazon of transportation. And just another FYI, for many hotels, the largest single line monthly expense to them is the commission paid to Booking. So how does that impact the business model of all those operators of mobility services that will be paying 10, 15, 20, 25% of their revenue to the disintermediary? How does that inform the business model? Anyone can tell you. I don't know that. So that's, again, I'm leaving with questions more than answers. And final slide, please. Last slide is a bit of a plug. We know that MaaS is changing the American form of mobility, and our supporters believe that we needed a specific group to discuss how that happens. And the goals of the association, again, are to create a representative forum to develop that framework that we discussed today and collect information and share it, and essentially help organizations make the best investments in MaaS that they can possibly make. And that's my presentation. Thank you, Luke. I'm sorry if I ran over.
No, thank you very much, Tim. I think it's really informative and thought-provoking at the same time. And I just know folks from speaking to Tim for some time. There's a board of folks behind MaaS America with a real broad grasp of the American mobility and transport ecosystem. So they're very, very well placed and did some really interesting stuff. We've got some couple of great questions that have come through already. To those of you who are listening, please continue to send them through. We're going to move forward, though, to our next presentation, which is from Yovav or Jay at Moovit, who, if you're not familiar, are doing some really, really cool stuff. It's all about this single interface mobility. But without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Yovav and let him tell you some more. So we are sharing the screen now. Hang on, we've got just unmuting you as well, Yovav. So give us one moment.
Thank you, Luke. And hello, everyone.
Fantastic. Has the shared screen come through?
Not yet.
Okay. Hang on a second. Bear with me.
Not yet.
Is that coming through now? Do you see? Sorry, we're just sort of.
Yes.
There we go. Fantastic.
Excellent.
So, Yovav, over to you.
So, thank you, Luke, again. Nice to meet you, everyone. My name is Yovav Meidad. I'm the Chief Growth and Marketing Officer for Moovit. Our mission at Moovit is really to help cities and transit agency increase ridership and customer satisfaction. And we do that because we believe that there are many challenges today that cities face. I actually want to start by sharing with you what's the real motivation for everyone that works in Moovit to come to the office every day and do what we do, and we've been doing it for the last 7 years. We truly believe that mobility is a basic human right. Why it's so important to invest in mobility? Because mobility opens opportunities for people. Mobility generates equal possibilities, no matter where people are born or where do they live. And mobility has many implications on different aspects of people's lives and things that the public sector have to deal with. They determine where people are going to be able to develop a career and whether they'll be able to travel, an hour or 30 minutes or 1.5 hours to their office, where our kids are going to go to school, whether our daughters, wives, neighbors will be able to travel late at night on the subway and reach any destination of their cities. And there are many researches out there that show that this is a really big issue. The aging population, of course, it's our responsibility to make sure that our parents, grandparents are able to travel conveniently and freely to a doctor's appointment or to the pharmacy or just to visit their grandkids. With so many people living with disabilities, over 1 billion people around the world, accessible mobility is something that we care about a lot, and we want to make sure that everybody has no barriers to access different services. And then, of course, there's the kind of the trivial stuff of pollution and congestion, which a lot of time when I talk about mobility, the first thing that comes to people's mind is just that. But there's much more than that, and that's why mobility is so important. And if you think about the cities where we all want to live in, these must be cities that are accessible, that are safe for everyone, that are green, affordable, equitable, and inclusive. And the way to achieve these type of cities is by converting as many people, as many drivers that use private cars today to consume mobility as a service. So just thinking about that, not just the academic, let's say, definition of MaaS, but the day-to-day consumption of people today of mobility services is primarily using private cars. And our mission is really to help cities make that shift. Now, how did we do it? We started 7 years ago with this mission of simplifying urban mobility all around the world. And luckily, we've been on this path since then. Initially, we focused on creating a product for consumers, for the citizens of different cities around the world. And we built the simplest and most intuitive mobility experience that they could have. And why is that? Because it combines all the information about all the different mobility services that are available in cities. When we started 7 years ago, it was primarily public transportation, public transit. And then in the last 2, 3, 4 years, as more new shared mobility and micromobility services started to pop up, we've integrated them as well, including ride-hailing services, etc. So ultimately, eventually, users who use Moovit has one application that gives them all the information that they need in order to make their journeys smoother and with more confidence, starting from a trip planning with step-by-step directions, if they need those, real-time arrivals, service alerts, payment integration, if it's available in selected cities, and other mobility options. Over the years, we've grown to be the largest, most popular urban mobility app in the world, with more than 500 million users using our app for iPhone, Android, and the web. We're growing at a very rapid pace of more than 1.2 million users that are using one of our platform, Moovit for one of our platforms. And we do not do it with spending any dollar on marketing. This is all organic, just to give you the idea of how valuable the service is, how critical the problem is that this product is solving. One of the unique things that the major user base that we have is allowing us to do is to collect anonymously data points that represents how users move in their urban surrounding. What's the demand for mobility? What type of lines they're riding, where they're transferring, etc. And we store that information in our big data repository. This is, of course, compliant with GDPR. We take users' privacy very seriously. We don't collect any personal information. Users do not need to give us their email address or create an account, and as I mentioned before, we collect all of this data anonymously. We've also, one of our key growth strategy was to open service in as many cities around the world as possible. And today we provide our services in more than 2,900 cities across 92 countries. The product is fully localized to 45 languages, and the amount of transit data that we have, information about the different transit agencies, their lines, their stops, their schedule, is now in the magnitude which is around 60 to 70% bigger compared to Google Maps, which is our biggest competitor. Not only we have the biggest transit data repository, it's also the most accurate one. And why is that? Because we use a lot of crowdsourced information to augment and enhance official information coming from transit agencies. And we use a number of methods, including data science and AI, in order to find information that needs to be updated. For example, stops that are mislocated in the official transit data sources coming from the transit agencies. We're also considered to be leaders in accessible mobility. and we've invested a lot in improving and adding different capabilities to our product for people with different accessibility needs. For users who have visual impairments, we support voiceover and talkback support, which are the screen reading technologies. For users with hand motor impairments, we optimize the UI to make it easier for them to use the product only with one hand. And for users who travel in wheelchairs or just families with young kids or baby strollers, we provide what we call wheelchair accessible routes, which guarantees a step-free route, including all of the transfers. And some of the partners related to accessibility, including Be My Eyes and Onse, and you can even read more about some real stories how Moovit users in different locations around the world share their experience. This was published on the Microsoft Transform blog, a story that we're very proud of. And as I mentioned before, we started by focusing on the consumers, and we're putting the consumers in a very high priority. One of our company's values is actually users first, and we make sure that the product experience and the user experience that we provide to users is superior, and it's evident also in the different rankings that we get on the store and the different recognition from Google, from Apple, a number of awards that we've won. So this is just a background of where we started, but we're not just a transit app, and that's something very important to understand. What we've done in the past 2 years is we leveraged the main assets that power the Moovit app for consumers and the unique assets that we've created in order to build on top of that brain 2 additional solutions for business customers and for cities and transit agencies. And the uniqueness of our solution is the fact that we have created the most powerful multimodal trip planner that combines any mean of transportation in the city, the most accurate transit data repository, as I mentioned before, more than 7,000 transit agencies, and using a number of methods to augment official data with crowdsourced data, and then people's movement data that represents a demand for mobility. And I'll give you a few examples of some of the companies that use our APIs, our solution for businesses to power their MaaS offering. So some of these companies have already expressed their interest to become mobility as a service providers, but they did not have access to transit information. As a matter of fact, getting accurate transit information and getting accurate and high quality trip plans is very complex. And that's why Uber is using Moovit Transit APIs to power their Uber Transit product, which is now live in 4 cities, Boston, Denver in the US, London in the UK, Sydney in Australia, and a number of additional cities will be launched as well. Lyft, I'm very proud of this because you are the first to hear this, announced today the availability of Lyft Transit in New York City, powered by Moovit. Another big customer company that announced their aspirations to be a mobility as a service provider, but getting transit and getting transit right is done thanks to our transit APIs. And Microsoft is another partner that chose to add Moovit Transit APIs into their Azure cloud. So these are examples of some customers that are using our APIs to power their mobility as a service offering. Now, in addition to that, we have another solution for cities and transit agencies or transit operators that would like to offer to their citizens mobility as a service, but don't have the technical skills or the software to do that. And what we have done is we have created a solution, a complete solution to power mobility as a service. These are just some of our existing customers and partners from across the US, Europe, Asia, and others. Some of them are cities, some of them are counties, some of them are transit operators, and they're using different components of our solution. So what does our solution include? One of the things that we saw is that mobility as a service, as a term or as a concept, is very evolving. Every city sees it a little bit different and has some different needs. And for that reason, we understood that we need to develop a platform that's very modular, that has a number of components that solves the common challenges of the cities and the transit operators. And each city can choose to which of these components to use. The core components are 5. The first one is a white label application. Many cities around the world are obligated by law to expose digitally information about the transit system, and then they want to add micromobility and others. Instead of hiring software developers or going to a small boutique software solution, we are allowing cities to create a white label app on top of Moovit and benefit from all the features, the great user experience that Moovit offers, and all of the future upgrades that we'll release. Cities that have mobile ticketing, we are also integrating into those systems as well. For example, with Masabi, we have some integrations. One of the unique solutions, components of our solution is the urban mobility analytics product that helps cities, transportation planners, and operators plan, analyze, and optimize any future solution before they're actually investing in making those changes. And it's possible only because we have this tremendous amount of data about supply and demand. Another component that is part of our platform is a full solution to power and plan on-demand fleets. We are very unique compared to other on-demand solutions because we bring the planning aspects before you put even a single shuttle on the road. And why it's possible? Again, because of our urban mobility analytics product. That's why we see some on-demand solutions out there that are failing because of lack of demand, and that lack of demand can have been identified ahead of time if proper mobility analytics tools were used. And that's how we are different and what we bring to the table. And finally, some of the transit operators that we are already working with have told us that they need real-time solution, a much more accurate real-time solution than solutions that are typically coming with a primitive, let's call it, or less modern AVL systems. And that's why we've developed a TimePro, which is a cloud-based, easy to deploy, light AVL solution to deliver the most accurate real-time and improve operational efficiency for transit agencies. So as you can see, it's one platform, but with a number of components, and each transit agency can choose which one to work with. I'll give you a number of examples. ATAF. ATAF is an Italian transit agency that chose to use 3 of the 5 components: the white label app, the urban mobility analytics, and the transport on demand. They operate, those who were not familiar, ATAF is the transportation authority of the city of Florence in Italy. Their fleet size is about 450. And when they came to us, they have 2 major challenges. And I think these are challenges that a lot of transit operators around the world can kind of connect with. First of all, they had a very outdated public transit-only app that did not support the new mobility services, micro-mobility services that were introduced in the market. The app was also fairly buggy because it was developed by a small boutique software house. The second challenge that they expressed was the fact that any studies that they do, they still rely on manual transport surveys. They send out students with clipboards to the street corners, and they ask citizens about their transportation needs, and that's a very inefficient way that cannot happen frequently. How did we solve their challenges? By the 3 products that they chose to work with us. The first objective was to grow ridership and reduce personal car usage by encouraging people to use a diverse menu of mobility alternatives, including micromobility, and our white label apps that is built on top of the Moovit multimodal trip planner is addressing that objective. The second objective was to have better transport system planning, and they're able to achieve that by using our urban mobility analytics product, a state-of-the-art data science powered by AI and big data products that gives them deep insights to how users use specific line or specific station and how are transfers occurring in certain hubs. And as they prepare for the future and they want to better utilize their fleet and reduce pollution, they're looking into introducing on-demand shuttles, and our on-demand product will be the way to power that. So you can see that they're starting with two products, but then say, because our system is built in a very modular way, even if they don't choose to use on-demand solutions now, our platform allows them to grow. Another example of a customer is Bus Italia. And Bus Italia chose to use Moovit Time Pro at the moment, with the option to add additional future components. Their challenges were related to the lack of real-time arrival in their cities, and also the need to expose real-time transit data via standard APIs. This is mandatory by the EU law. Another very important challenge that they had, when they're talking and looking at different AVL systems, typically those require to take a fleet out of a vehicle out of service for a number of days, run some wires, etc. And they wanted a solution that would have minimal impact on downtime. And finally, they're looking into future AVM systems, and they want to choose an AVL solution, just a real-time component solution that will be able to integrate into any future product and systems that they'll get in the future. Now, Moovit Time Pro, as I mentioned before, is a modern AVL system that running in the cloud. It's cloud-based, doesn't require any custom hardware or installation. Every bus driver is equipped with an Android tablet. So if there's no custom hardware that needs to be installed, and if there's a malfunction in the tablet, they can simply replace it, and they did not need to actually remove the vehicle and install a custom hardware. We've also implemented a number of important reports that allows them to optimize their on-time performance, and this way improve the accuracy and the way schedule matches real time. This is very important because eventually their objective is to improve rider satisfaction, to regain the trust of citizens in the public transit system. And as more citizens will opt in to use public transit, less will use cars, and our objective of reducing private car ownership will be achieved this way. So these are just two examples of transit operators, how we are partnering with them and how we are offering them different components that are part of our MaaS platform. And altogether, we're working with different cities, different municipalities around the world, different transit agencies that leverage the different assets that we've created over time. I invite those that would like additional information to check our website, maas.moovit.com. We'd love to talk to you and tell you more how we might be able to help your challenges.
Thank you, Yovav. I think I always find listening to Moovit really illuminating. There's some discovered data is almost mind-boggling, and Yovav's clearly doing a phenomenal job with the extent of partners they have. We've had a couple of really great questions to Yovav in particular, but I'm just conscious with time to introduce to you our final presenter, which is Willie Doman, who is Director Technology Services at Riga Corporation. Willie works very closely with Tim and is going to talk to us on some of the business model styles with mobility as a service. So Willie, can you hear us if we unmute you now?
I can hear you really well. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Willie. So we'll move on to the first of the slides now. Hang on a second. Here we go. So, Willie, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. In the interest of time, I'm going to get right into this presentation here. So, to open up my presentation, I mean, as over time, as we traveled kind of around the world, MaaS was always kind of public transport focused. But MaaS America, clearly, one of the things is we are not just public transport focused. And as Tim earlier said, the personal automobile is actually a big part of MaaS. So we have to actually live in harmony with, how people get around today. So to kind of start this off, I mean, and it's not just in North America, but this is MaaS America. So this transportation ecosystem is clearly North America focused a bit. So, but throughout the world, you have two basic elements there to the transportation ecosystem. First, there's the private sector, and then traditionally, it has always been the public sector. So in the public sector, you have, government-run parking. Airports is kind of in the middle. There are privately run airports, but there are also, the majority of the airports are, run by government agencies. And then you have the traditional transport operators that, operate traditional buses, light rail, heavy rail, commuter rail, and then there's road tolling. On the private sector side, you have basically what I like to call the disruptors. The disruptors are the Lyfts and Ubers. I mean, they definitely disintermediated or beginning to intermediate more and more the taxis. But you have on-demand car services. But there's also a lot of private road tolling and private parking operators. Now, in the middle, traditionally, is the customer. The customer, if the customer wanted to plan a trip, they had to figure out how best to make that trip and which services to use. So the customer is in the middle, and all the transport operators, in most cases, they all serve directly or connect directly to the customer. Can we go back to the other slide? Yeah, thank you. So we have a frame of reference. What I'd like to do is I'd like to use two Willie Doman use cases. Okay, so when I commute to downtown San Francisco's CBD, I drive, get in my car in the morning, I drive to the ferry. I mean, I can take a bike, but I can take the bus, but because of, of convenience, I drive to the ferry. Then I park at the ferry terminal, and I use a Park mobile app to pay for parking. Then when I ride the ferry, I take out my wallet, tag it on the reader, and I use my Clipper card. And then when I come into downtown San Francisco, depending on if I go to the office or if I go to client meetings, I can take an Uber to the client, or I can transfer to a BART train to the client. The second use case is on those days when I need my car for conducting business in the CBD. So when I drive into downtown San Francisco, I pay a bridge toll with Fast Track. I park in the building, which is a private parking operator. I drive to the meeting, and I use, because it's a city-run parking lot, I use Pay by Phone app. And then when I come back to my building, I have to pay again to a private operator. And then in the afternoon, I take a BART train to a meeting. I mean, all of these are disconnected transits. All of these are disconnected transportation-related services. And to me, now we can go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, to me, what MaaS is about, a MaaS ecosystem is about, is that, first of all, I don't have to have all of these or manage multiple different transportation-related accounts. All of these accounts that I sign up for, the first thing is they all have my personal data, my credit card data. So needless to say, the more I put out there, the higher the probability of my personal data getting compromised. Now, the MaaS ecosystem, to make this a more seamless experience for me, the MaaS ecosystem still has the same, basically builds off of the transport ecosystem. What we do is we layer on top of the transport ecosystem. In the middle, we have a MaaS application. And today, there's MaaS applications, Moovit, we just heard from one presenter previously. There's also applications like Park Mobile, Cubics of the world, and in Australasia, you know, there's an emerging technology, Frenzy is coming up. So there's the MaaS applications. They basically reside on a mobile device. And the next layer is to make that mobile device work, we need a communications network in place. The communications network is provided by the AT&Ts, Verizons, Vodafones, and other parts of the world. They provide the communications network to some kind of cloud services provider. And earlier we heard is Microsoft Azure is hosting Moovit's data in the cloud, but you also have other players there, the Amazons and the Googles of the world. And then the final layer is, and this is most likely the most important layer, because this is the layer that needs the most development and needs the most cooperation to really make MaaS work. And that's an open data sources to be able to exchange data between the different transport providers and the MaaS application providers in order to really serve the customer, which is in the middle of all these transport services. So in order to really make this work, it definitely requires, number one, it requires a cooperation between private sector and public sector. For a long time, the private sector was holding its data very closely to its heart, did not necessarily want to share their data with the public sector transport providers. And in order to really make this MaaS ecosystem work, this is where you know, a lot of the focus will be for MaaS America. So with that, I'd be open to any questions.
Brilliant, thank you, Willie. And I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there as we get to our conclusion around open data, which is, I think, will dictate much of how we evolve in this space. I'm very conscious of time, and just to caveat, we've got a lot of great questions come through. I will be relaying these to all of the three excellent folk on the panel today to respond to, and I'll send that out to you guys as a report. And if you listen to this as a recording, you'll receive both sort of not too far apart. But we've had one question I thought does deserve a mention. I guess it's probably most directed to Yovav, but it's potentially to the three of you. And I guess it's coming from a position of wanting to make sure mobility as a service is successful in my own city. So the question being, before implementing MaaS in a city, what are the most important factors to take into consideration?
Yeah, so I kind of covered it a little bit. I mentioned it during my my earlier presentation, but I think one of the things that we have found are extremely important is the ability to have accurate data about supply and demand prior to making any kind of change or infrastructure change. And when I say supply and demand, I mean Supply are all the mobility options available to users, starting from public transportation, micromobility, and others. And it's key that the MaaS solutions that will be offered will be a solution that will include the combination of all of them and not just part of them, not just integrate public transit, but skip over a number of micromobility services, because it's critical to have that part. Second thing is to have analytics data about how people travel today, and whether when you kind of put supply and demand on the same map, you can identify pockets for optimization or areas where there's unmet demand with very little supply. The third thing is to what we've seen, and what we've seen in places where MaaS succeeds and MaaS fails, is the fact that eventually people need to consume it through an application, and if the city or the municipality cannot generate enough traction to the product, to the app, that will be the primary interface to mobility, all these services that might be offered in the city, shuttle lines and others, might run empty. And it's critical to partner with a company that has a substantial user base, or if it's the city chooses to offer a white label app, the city needs to invest a lot in marketing. In our case, I can say that Moovit also offers city kind of a co-brand approach, leveraging the user base that we have, and this way the city doesn't need to invest in user acquisition. They tap into the user base of Moovit, which is substantial. So just to recap, user base, supply, and demand data are, in my opinion, the three critical components to make MaaS successful in a city.
No, thank you very much. Tim, Willie, anything to add? I know Yovav was quite comprehensive there, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I do. I think you have to start simple. We need to recognize that every city MaaS in every city is going to look different, because you have a different mix of services, and there's also different behavior patterns of the commuters. So, I mean, that's the first thing is start simple, a simple connection between, public transit and Lyft, public transit, maybe the toll road, public transit and parking. One of my commutes is I drive across a bridge, I park at a BART station, I grab my bike, I ride BART, and when I get to my BART destination, I get on my bike to go to our headquarters office. So everywhere it's going to look a little different. So clearly determine, where you want to start, where the critical mass is, and then build off of that and build relationships that are easy to build between parking and public transit is one, between public transit and bike share is one. And then once you have that in place and you can begin building critical mass, then start scaling the complexity, start including other services that people may be using. But what it really takes is you need to just kind of have a pretty good idea of the demographics, what the commute patterns are, and then you build off of that.
Thank you, Tim. Willie, any closing remarks? I guess final remarks to you, sir.
None from me.
No.
In which case, I'll take at this point. I've got questions here from connections with public transit, from what's happening from micromobility. There's all sorts coming, and I don't want to open these sort of interesting but sort of extensive kind of worms now, because I'm conscious of the time. I will send this around to folk and actually send this all out to you as a document you can read through later. So I want to take this moment just to say, Tim, Yovav, Willie, thank you very much. Your time is greatly appreciated. Yovav will be with us on stage in San Diego in November at Impact Mobility, as will Tim, and I believe Willie is also joining us. We've got a really strong group, lots of US cities from both East and West Coast and folk like Moovit who are really solving some of these problems. So please join us if you're not already. And any questions, reach out to me directly. Happy to chat. So thank you all. Have a great day, and we'll be in touch very soon. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.